started to make sure that we can fit all of our content in. Lots of exciting things to share. Thank you for joining our webinar, Making the Case for Workplace Wellbeing in K-12 Education, how schools, school district, and stakeholder leaders can achieve more buy-in for greater investment in teacher and principal well-being. So I'm Paul MacArthur. I'm the Knowledge Manager with the McConnell Foundation. We'll also have Andre Urbez from the EdCan Network helping us with the presentation today. And our data science and messaging guru, Tova Paglaro from Avalanche Strategy will be joining us as well. So a few notes on the background and why we've come to be presenting this information to you here. So the McConnell Foundation is a private family foundation based out of Montreal that works all across Canada on systemic, social, economic, environmental challenges. We use granting, investing, convening, and co-creation strategies with a social innovation approach to build a more innovative, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient Canada. WellAhead is the Foundation's initiative in child youth mental health. We focus on systems change and have been supporting education systems across Canada for the last 4 years to integrate social and emotional well-being as a core part of K-12 education. We currently in our strategy have 2 priority areas, one of them being advancing system-wide approaches to address student well-being, and the other catalyzing action on workplace well-being in K-12, which will be the focus of some of the presentation today. So why is workplace well-being in K-12 education important? Stress impacts staff well-being first and foremost. So we have an increasing data set that's showing some pretty significant impacts on the well-being of educators. In Quebec, we've seen teachers experiencing high levels of burnouts. A study from Ontario is showing that Ontario principals, too many of them are reporting using unhealthy coping strategies. That staff stress affects student outcomes, which is a lot of what brings educators to work every day. So when staff have higher levels of stress, so do students, and it affects their performance in academics, reduces their feelings of belonging at school and support from teachers. And then furthermore, that these impacts have broader effects on the system. Teacher turnover, which is largely due to staff stress in cases, has high costs to the system, which can at times lead to long-term leave. Studies from BC have shown that this costs that system millions of dollars every year that could be avoidable. A little about how the McConnell Foundation is approaching workplace well-being in K-12. So we think about our strategy a little bit like an iceberg. So the practices and some of the things that we're supporting above the water level are things that we're doing, like sharing information on strategies and approaches to improve workplace well-being, building the evidence base by supporting novel research and interventions in the field. And then below the waterline, this is where some of the work that we're going to present today really fits, is trying to understand and shift some of the mindsets that are held around teacher, staff, and leader well-being, as well as explore how to better frame this issue. So I'll pitch it over to Andre at EdCan to go through the next couple of slides.
Thanks so much, Paul. All right, so this is Andre from EdCan speaking, and if you've been following us online or on social media, you'll know that this week we've launched our very new and very exciting new initiative called Well at Work. So some of you on this call have actually contributed to Well at Work, and this is an initiative that is all about encouraging people to make workplace well-being a top priority in K-12 education. So our primary focus is to get leaders to commit to making this a priority, but also getting everyone within schools or school districts or any staff member really who works in K-12 public education to really make this an investment. What we know from research is that every member of the school community plays a role in creating culture. How we speak and how we act influences how our colleagues feel and influences the overall workplace environment. So we're all really about creating awareness about, how and educator or staff well-being in schools are basically two sides of the same coin, and they each interact and impact each other. So we're all about providing you with that awareness, but also providing you with practical tools that will help you take your first steps. Next slide. All right, so Well at Work is built on 3 key objectives. The first, as I mentioned, is to build awareness about why this is an urgent need and why we need to invest in workplace well-being. And we try to do that through building a shared understanding. What we've noticed is that there's a lot of misconceptions and assumptions that people may have about being in the education profession. And so we'd like to just tackle those and get past that and build a shared awareness about why this is an important investment. Second, we'd like to amplify real stories from staff members and educators on the ground who actually work within the education workplace and get their stories and their vision about what well-being actually looks like for them in the workplace. And lastly, we seek to support school districts, schools, and ministries of education from different provinces and territories who are ready to take that first step to make workplace well-being a priority, or who are already prioritizing workplace well-being. Next slide. So how do we do all of this amazing work? And we also do it in 3 key ways. So as you'll notice after this call, you'll likely get an invitation or sort of a news memo about 2 sort of events that we'll be planning in the upcoming year. And these are national events that are really targeting bringing together a wide variety of stakeholders so that we can really come together and craft a common vision for workplace well-being in K-12 education. What we also do is we transform research, whether that be in Canada or abroad internationally, and we take that research and we try to make it fun and exciting. So, research is something that is really transformative and can really impact our lives for the better. And so we're all about making research fun, exciting, and easy to understand. And so one of the ways we do that is through making research into relatable stories that show real faces and real people who are in the workplace. And lastly, we collaborate with experts, some of you on this call, in fact, to really break down what the research says. And we do that through fun things like podcasts, videos, infographics, fact sheets, and so much more. All right, so that's all, folks. If you'd like to check us out, you can check us out at edcan.ca/wellatwork.
Great, thanks. So we're going to move into a little bit of background on the study. As we do some of this presentation, just a note to the folks that are participating, if you have questions throughout, just please type them into the chat, and we'll do our best to address those. We've saved some time at the end of the presentation for that. So why would we do a framing study? And this is what we were trying to approach with the work that we've led with Avalanche Strategy. This is a quote from Nat Kendall-Taylor, who is the CEO of the Frameworks Institute, which is their mandate. They do framing studies so they can better understand how to frame social issues to move them ahead and get them more traction. He says, understanding is frame dependent. What does that mean? It matters not just what you say, but how you say it. It's just not about your content knowledge, but that real how you say it is really important. We can actually learn about how to do that really effectively, and that was really the purpose of what we were trying to accomplish with the work here. So our purpose of this study was to surface ways to more effectively communicate the importance of teacher and staff well-being to increase buy-in for this very important social issue. Our method was to better understand how people both inside and outside of the education system think and feel about teacher and principal well-being through a large-scale online survey. Tova is going to speak a little bit more to the specific methodology of that survey in a sec. And our application, what are we actually going to do with the things that we found? Part of it, we're hoping to explore right on this call. So we're trying to leverage those insights from the research to develop and share some language, some ways of framing this issue that we can maximize traction for improving workplace well-being in K-12. So I'll turn it over to you, Tova, to go over the next number of slides on what we found from this study and a little bit about the approach.
Great, thanks so much. So hi, thanks for joining. My name is Tova with Avalanche. And I think the first thing before we dive into the findings, and we'll get there soon, I'm sure everyone's keen, is just a little bit about how we do the work we do. You'll find that it's a little bit different than what you might think about as a traditional survey. And that's because the work we do is really rooted in qualitative data. So our approach to framing anything well is that in order to communicate with people in a way that resonates, we need to be able to reflect the things that really matter to them, their priorities, their values, their emotions. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to really listen to them to understand what it is they care about and how they're thinking about key issues. So just from a really, really simple principle way, the way that we've built this technology and this strategy is that how we think about things shapes how we talk about them. So our priorities, our values, our emotions all inform the words, the metaphor, the tone that we use. So our approach, and if you could switch the slide, Paul, just really reverses that. We're looking at the words, the metaphors, and the tone that people use when they're talking about issues they care about in order to understand those priorities, values, and emotions. Next slide, Paul. The process that we use is really pretty simple. First, we develop what we call a series of prompts. It's essentially an open-ended survey, lots of open-ended questions that really elicit people to tell stories, to talk about what they care about. We collect really large samples of that so that we end up with representative accuracy in all of the ways that matter. And then we analyze that language using a combination of human experts and AI, natural language processing, in order to reveal how folks are relating to those issues. And then we develop a series of recommendations based on that analysis that really helps you to reflect the priorities, the values, the emotions, and the attitudes of the folks who you most need to either persuade or mobilize so that you can really resonate with them. And for me, doing that with this issue in particular is super exciting. I'm a mom with 3 kids in public school, and so just really, really believe in the work that you're all doing and excited to be a part of it. Next slide, please, Paul. So for this study, we've had 2 samples. First, we had what we call a public sample. There we listened to folks from the public, people who aren't part of the education system, from 3 provinces, from Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. We listened in English only, and the sample was census representative. So it was balanced based on the census for political ideology, race, gender, age, and actually income as well, though that's not represented on the slide. We also listened to an educator sample. So those are folks who were in the education system. That sample was also from Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario, also English only, and this was primarily through opt-in from partner lists. I know some of the folks on this call sent out that listening survey, and we appreciate that, as did WellAhead. And so this isn't representative to census the same way, but rather representative of the folks who are part of your community, part of your network, who identify as educators and who responded to the survey. So moving on then into the key findings. Thank you, Paul. So there's sort of 4 big themes that we're going to look at today. The first was that stress is a more salient concept than well-being. I know this is one of the big questions that a lot of folks have been wrestling around with. Is stress too negative? Is well-being clearly enough defined? How do people relate to these things? Same way, not same way? We're going to dive into some detail, but at the really top level, stress is more salient than well-being. The second thing we're going to look at is that most people agree that stress affects performance, but it isn't seen as a top priority within the education system. And we'll look at some of the specifics around that in a moment. We also see really clearly in the data that people relate quite differently to teachers and to principals. So one of the things we did in the methodology with this particular instrument is that we split the sample, and half of the people, both in the public and in the education sample, received a listening survey about teachers. The questions were the exact same, but the word teachers was the subject, and the other half of the sample received a survey about principals. I have an snap, something went wrong while displaying the web page. Paul, Can you still see me, hear me?
I can still hear you, and I think folks online can still see the deck.
Okay, well, I'm just going to keep going then, and hopefully we can stay aligned on which slide we're on. So I'm still currently on 19. So people relate differently to teachers and principals, and we were able to really uncover that by asking half of the sample about teachers in those open-ended prompts and the other half about principals, and then comparing those, and we'll look at that. And finally, presenting facts has pretty limited influence, and stories are really, really important. And again, there was a couple of ways that we dug into that and measured it. We'll look in a moment at the specifics, but that really aligns with what we know across the board about communicating effectively with people. You know, that stories are really how we make sense of the world, and it's incredibly important to embed them in our communications, even when what we're looking to communicate is really fact-based and based on evidence. Next slide, please. So we're now talking about sort of point number one, stress is more salient than well-being in terms of a concept. And so respondents were asked two questions. They were asked to respond to a statement, teachers or principals, depending which survey they got, have a lot of stress, or we need to improve teacher or principal well-being. And then we were able to look at the distribution, next slide, of how folks are relating to that, to those two prompts. And we can see that in both the educator and the public sample, people express more support and less reservation, and also more understanding in reaction to the stress framing. So what we see on the right-hand side, this is the first chart we're looking at, so I'm just going to take a moment and help us get situated. We can see two samples here. We can see the stress framing, and we can see the well-being framing. And within the stress framing, along the vertical axis, we have the percentage of respondents, and then along the horizontal axis, we have a couple of different ways that people are relating. So the first in green is really supportive language, people who simply agree with the statement. Yep, it's true, I agree. The yellow bar there, we see people with reservations. Sort of tepid, conditional, or wavering support. And remember, this is in their open-ended, so this is through linguistic analysis. So there can be some overlap here. People can say, yep, I agree, but I'm, you know, a little concerned about this. Or like, yeah, I mostly agree, but is what we see in this with reservations. And finally, in gray, we have don't understand. I really don't understand what the problem is or why it would need to be fixed. And so we can see with a stress framing, both the principal and the teacher survey really high levels of support. And with the well-being framing, what we see is that the support doesn't drop off entirely, but with reservations becomes much, much higher. And not understanding also climbs pretty substantially. Next slide, please. Bringing that to life, it's helpful just to hear a few of those responses. And so when we use that well-being framing, we hear things like, would they be happier or less stressed or what? What is well-being defined as? Just really not clear to people what that means exactly. I'm not sure specifically how you define well-being, but if you interpret it to mean that teachers will be supported in how they deal with children, good. And we would all benefit from improving well-being, and for teachers in particular, as it relates to their ability to connect with students on a regular basis. One of the things that I'm sure you're already starting to really pick up is that when we give people the opportunity to tell us what's important to them in this space, they immediately start to go to a place of what's best for the children and what's best for the students. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to see weaving its way throughout the findings. Switching over to the stress framing, definitely agree. So much is expected of teachers and they aren't given the resources they need. It must be increasing because of problem students, high workload, increased class sizes, threats of layoff, etc. I agree. Less stress is key to job performance, and in this case, to kids' learning. And determine the cause, decide what's acceptable, and how to keep stress at a manageable level. So really we see a theme here of sort of applying what folks know about job performance and about stressors, and applying that to the educator scenario specifically. And again, making that connection between here, really kind of talking about it in terms of job performance, but what's best for the kids. Next slide, please. So just in terms of really simple framing recommendations, boiling that down, we want to frame educator stress as a challenge that negatively impacts job performance, and measures to address this as positively impacting student outcomes. We also want to be really careful to avoid vague references to well-being. It isn't that that language doesn't resonate at all. People are still on board, but they have some reservations and they don't understand as much. So when we're talking about well-being, it's really important not to be sort of airy-fairy, and instead to really ground that in clear definitions and clear outcomes related to student impact. Next slide, please. Most agree, sort of big finding number 2, most agree stress affects performance, but it isn't seen as a top priority. So participants were asked, how much do you believe the quality of K-12 education would be improved by reducing the stress of teachers or principals and investing in their well-being? Most agreed that stress would improve the quality, reducing stress would improve the quality of K-12 education, and educators were much more likely than the public sample to believe this to be true. So here we're looking at the distribution, the chart on the right-hand side, the distribution of responses to that question about the impact on quality of education by reducing teacher stress. And we can see that most people believe that reducing stress has a positive effect, but only 23% of respondents believe that reducing teacher stress would significantly improve the quality of education, and the majority believe it would slightly or moderately improve the quality of education. In open-ended format, next slide please, we also ask people, what do you think is the greatest challenge that keeps teachers from doing their best work? And what you can see on the right-hand side is a distribution of the themes that emerge in those open-ended responses. So here, underneath of each of these, as you can imagine, there's a whole array of things that roll up into the concept of time and resources, or roll up into the kids. And to understand that a little bit better, you can see the definitions on the left-hand side. So time and resources can include things like references to class sizes, people citing funding, and people citing more need for one-on-one time. The kids can include citations and references in that open-ended language to kids' behavior, to restrictions, to discipline, to parents, challenges with kids in the classroom. The politics, folks talking about unions, bureaucracy, boards, and administration. Teachers, references really specifically to skills, motivations, and attitudes of the educator. Structure, things, people talking about pay and accountability, structural fixes. Curriculum, citations of folks just pointing to the curriculum as the challenge, the greatest challenge. And then we do see stress, where people are talking about stress as the greatest challenge or top priority that's keeping teachers from doing their best work. Just too much, we see over in green, too many expectations, a lack of downtime, too much on their plate. We see a lot of interconnection there between that and stress, but people talking about it a little bit differently. And then finally, managing staff. This is really in reference to principals and the critical skills around management. So what we see over here is that when we open it up to what folks perceive to be the greatest challenge that keeps teachers from doing their best work, stress does come up, but much more likely people are talking about time and resources, and then about challenges with kids and behavior. Finally, we ask in this section about the emotion that describes how people feel about those challenges that teachers and principals face at work and in the classroom. And what becomes really evident quite quickly is that worry and sadness really dominate, followed by this concept that that's just the way it is, essentially ambivalence and acceptance of the status quo. And we can see that when folks are responding to teachers, more worry and sadness, and when folks are responding to principals, more ambivalence. More sort of that's just the way it is. Next slide, please. And so moving from there into the framing recommendations, people generally believe that stress and well-being do have an impact on the quality of education, but they also believe there are more pressing priorities. Therefore, it's really important to frame initiatives that reduce teacher stress as complementary and connected to the issues that are perceived as the greatest challenges in education: time, resource, and classroom behavior. These are things that are really, really salient for people and that they immediately understand as being challenges that are affecting the quality of education. And the more we can tie efforts to help folks manage stress, to reduce stress, to show up as their sort of best self in the classroom, the more that connection is going to become really clear for people, and the more salient this issue is going to become. We also see those really high levels of worry, sadness, and ambivalence about the challenges faced by principals and teachers, and that really points to the importance of telling stories that inspire agitation and hope. We need to communicate the positive impact of addressing challenges and to inspire hope and engagement around the issue. Moving on to the next point, we see that people relate really differently to teachers and principals. You've probably already just started to pick that up, but just to bring it to life a little bit more, we talked about how surveys were randomly assigned to frame the questions either about teachers or principals. And across the board, a lot of analysis indicated differences in responses. This actually really builds on findings that the Framework Institute study had that pointed to the fact that when the public thinks about education, they think more about the tangible triad, teachers, parents, and students. And that's certainly confirmed in what we see. Next slide, please. So what we see is that especially among the public, there's pretty different beliefs about the impact for principals and for teachers of reducing stress. So if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, the bar on the farthest left, significantly improved. We see that in the principal segment, only about 11% of respondents believe that reducing principal stress and investing in well-being will significantly improve the quality of education. And on the right-hand side, that dark green bar, we see that about 33% of respondents believe reducing teacher stress and investing in well-being will significantly improve the quality of education. And then you can follow the diagonal of those bars all on your own. Next slide, please. The same thing really holds true when we look at educator beliefs about the impact of reducing stress. And so here we're looking specifically at the sample of educators, those 450 people who self-identified as educators and chose to take the survey. And in this segment, we see that the percentage of folks who believe that reducing principal stress and investing in well-being climbs up to nearly 30%, who believe that it will have a significant, moderate, or a slight improvement. So, almost 90% across those three. But when we jump over to the teacher side, we see that 60% believe that reducing teacher stress will significantly improve education. And then another 22% in moderate improvement. And so you can really see that stark difference in the perceived impact on the quality of education. Next slide, please. So just moving to recommendations, the public have a really limited understanding of the role of principals and believe that reducing teacher stress will have a larger impact than principals. We really see that in the qualitative open-ended as well. People not understanding what it is that principals do, but also really seeing the connection between teachers and students as being more tangible, and therefore an investment in teacher stress as being more directly impactful for students. When communicating about educator stress reduction or well-being initiatives, we recommend leading with the connection between teacher stress and student success. That seems to be the connection that's most salient for most people. And if you are communicating about principals, really make sure to be very clear about the role they play to support educators and students. Don't assume that the audience knows what a principal's role looks like and how a stress reduction initiative for a principal would impact student outcomes. Next slide, please. Finally, our fourth sort of big takeaway, presenting facts has a limited influence. Stories are more effective. And so participants who responded to the open-ended survey, to the listening survey, were presented one of two fact statements. The first was a finding about teachers, the second a finding about principals. Both of them really based in research, right? So research says that teachers experience as much stress as paramedics and police officers, and that up to 30% of Canadian teachers leave the profession in their first 5 years, largely due to workload and the stress of the job. Next, research says that school principals experience stress at a rate of 1.7 times higher than the rest of the population, leading to burnout, mental health problems, and to increased turnover. We then ask a series of questions about how folks are responding to that. Next slide, please. But most importantly is really, having read this finding, how much do you believe that the quality of kindergarten to grade 12 education would be improved by reducing teacher stress and investing in well-being? Ultimately, that's what we're after. And across the whole sample, on average, there's very little evidence that the finding effectively shifts position about the impact of reducing teacher stress or investing in well-being on the quality of education. And you can see the distributions on the right-hand side of the impact of the teacher finding in green, of the principal finding in purple, before and after the well-being fact. Next slide, please. What we do see by contrast is that teachers are really valued for dedication and care. And so this really suggests a different pathway than really leading with those facts. What we see is that when we ask folks to tell us in an open-ended way about the best kindergarten to grade 12 teacher or principal they ever knew, and to tell us about what made them so great, a couple of themes really emerge. The first, and we've represented some of those in blue, is about being taught well. And the second, represented in orange, is about being treated well. Finally, on the right-hand side, we have a gray bar at 20%. That is folks who really couldn't tell a specific story about their best teacher, which is pretty remarkable. Only 20% of people couldn't tell us a really specific story about what made one of their educators so incredibly important in their life. One of the other themes that really emerges across all of this is that respondents talk about how these attributes in combination, being taught well and being treated well, are key to enabling them as students to discover their own potential. So it really connects to that student success metric that we know is so important for getting people on board with this. And there are two specific attributes on the left-hand side of the blue, on the left-hand side of the orange, that really jump off the chart. The first is going above and beyond. Almost 20% of respondents in their own open-ended language talking about teachers going above and beyond for them, coaches showing up after time, people really putting in the dedication to understand their students, putting in the time to make the classroom an interesting place. That sort of concept of above and beyond is very valued. And the second is caring, just really caring deeply, being an empathetic listener, really caring about the well-being of their students, really caring about the success and investing in that. Those two things very, very connected. This suggests that it's really important in these well-being initiatives not to be, and maybe we can switch to the framing recommendations, Paul, not to be undermining this belief that and this value of teachers that do go above and beyond and teachers that care so deeply for their students, but rather investing in the support structures that allow teachers to do those things to the best of their ability and to be taken care of while they're doing those things. So we want to tell stories and we want to support with facts. We know that leading with facts raises defenses and lacks empathy. We want to connect teacher stress to inhibiting those education qualities that we value most, going above and beyond, bringing out the potential of each child, and acting from a place of care. We need to make it clear that when teachers are experiencing really high levels of stress, it becomes very difficult for them to do those things that we value most. And we need to connect these stories to the greatest perceived barriers to quality education: time, resources, student behavior, and discipline. And that as those things become more reduced, as those things are more challenging, stress rises, and we need to be investing in the stress to allow our teachers to be able to continue to deliver that really incredible education that we all value so much. So moving on to the next slide, a couple of summary recommendations based on all of that. Just to reiterate, stress is more salient as a concept than well-being. So we want to frame educator stress as a challenge that negatively impacts job performance, and measures to address this as positively impacting student outcomes. We want to avoid those vague references to well-being and make sure we really ground those in a clear understanding. Most people agree, stress affects performance, but it's not a top priority. And so we need to connect initiatives to reduce teacher stress to top priorities in education. And we need to communicate the positive impact of addressing those challenges and inspire hope and engagement. That's really to overcome that apathy. We need to show people that there's another way and that other way is connected to the student outcomes they care about so much. People relate really differently to teachers and principals. So we want to lead with teachers as the key targets for well-being efforts. And then we want to be really careful to communicate the role of principals in supporting teachers and students to build that connected awareness. And finally, presenting facts only has limited influence and stories are more effective. So we want to communicate using stories of how educator stress impacts students, and we want to support those stories with facts. We want to communicate how too much stress prevents educators from embodying what we value most in educators, and how when we successfully put in place measures to address this, student outcomes are positively affected. And I think at that stage, we would kick it back over to you, Paul.
Yeah, so we do have one more slide here, Tova, I can present, or you can, around some of the strategies to sort of limit blowback from the messaging that we use. Did you want to walk through this one, or?
Oh, good point. Thanks so much. Right. So there were a couple of interesting blowback findings. The first was that we do want a message about the societal importance of good teachers, but we don't want to compare their stress to other helping professions, example, first responders. So one of the really interesting things was that in that example that compared to first responders, people really clearly expressed believing both were valuable and also believing they were very different, and not a small portion of people being actually a bit offended by that comparison. So really being careful to talk about the value of teachers for the things we know they're valued for most, the urgency of addressing this problem in connection to those student outcomes, and not trying to draw those connections between other helping professions. Again, don't frame the issue as being about less work. So wanting to be really careful in that stress reduction about not talking about teachers doing less work, but rather about enabling teachers to do their best work. Again, really connecting to what we know is most valued in the public and also in educators themselves who, I'm sure I don't need them preaching to the choir here, but who go into this, this field in order to be able to do that really incredible work and have pretty strong reactions, what we see in the qualitative data about the suggestion that they would do less. And so really about enabling people to do their best work. And finally, we do want to frame workplace well-being initiatives as being complementary to those that are addressing the most pressing issues in education, and to be very careful not to let them be seen as competing with those other priority issues. So they need to be seen as complementary to issues with times and resources and challenging behaviors in the classroom, and not to be seen as competing with those things that are so salient for people. Thanks, Paul, for flagging that last bit about blowback. Back over to you now.
Thank you, Tova, for running through all that, at times, dense information that you had to sort through it to really make some interesting conclusions, draw some interesting conclusions from, and turn that into some really practical recommendations. So we're really excited about what we're able to do with this work. Just moving forward, trying to advance our slide. I'm actually going to pitch it back over to Andre, and we're going to open it up for questions in a bit. So if any questions emerge, please type them into the chat and get Andre to walk through this next one.
Hi there, folks. This is Andre back again from EdCan. All right, so we've reached the point in our webinar, and this webinar has been all about understanding how to effectively communicate about the importance of investing in staff well-being in the education workplace. So now we'd like to turn it over to you. So it's your chance to really think through what you've been presented with today. So we'd like you to think about different audiences that you'd like to communicate the importance of this investment to. So for example, if you're a member of the public, maybe the audience you'd like to communicate with is your school trustee. Or if you're a teacher, maybe you'd like to communicate that with other teachers or other staff members or colleagues. If you're a district leader, maybe you'd like to communicate that with other leaders or other principals or school leaders. So let's take a moment. We're going to put a minute or two on the clock. This is going to be our minute mingle for you to turn to the person to your right or to your left. If you're alone, this could be a personal exercise, but just think through who you'd like to take this to and how you could present this information to them to convince them that this is a worthy and important investment to make. All right, so we're going to put a minute on the clock. And as well, I'd like to encourage you as well, if you have any questions, we will be taking questions after this short exercise, so please post your questions into the chat box. right, folks. So we hope you enjoyed your 1 to 3 minute mingle and had some, great opportunity to think through how you would communicate this message. Just wanted to add that because of the large number of people in this group, we are actually going to have an opportunity for you to share any of your thoughts, if you'd like to, about this particular exercise with us in a follow-up form that's going to follow this webinar. So what we'll do right now is we will take your questions. So thank you to everyone who have been posting your questions. That's awesome, so lovely to see. So I'm just going to pick a few questions here. So I'll start with the one that I saw from Paulina. Paulina says, I am curious about any survey tools, questionnaires to help us gauge what staff define as well-being or wellness, and also gauge their level of well-being or wellness. So Tova and Paul, is there anything that we've taken from the survey to help us see how staff define well-being or wellness?
I would say that wasn't really the focus of this particular survey, as we were trying to better understand how people think and feel about the issue rather than describe what well-being means to them. I think one of the things that Tova did mention was that using well-being as a concept, it's actually really important to define what that means to people because it can be quite nebulous at times. People, when we use that word, they don't understand what it means for me, and that's an important part of communicating well. When we look at that versus a stress framing of this particular issue, people have a more concrete understanding of what that means, and that's probably one of the mechanisms that helps us to understand why it resonates a little bit more. Tova, is there anything you want to add? And she may be still on mute. Okay, maybe we'll move on to the next one, Andre.
Okay, awesome. So we have a question from Brian Angelic. Does this mean the focus is on reduced stress rather than increasing well-being, or reducing stress so we can increase well-being?
Increase well-being. Yeah, this would be helpful. Tova, are you able to hear us and contribute? Because I think this would be a good one for you to take. I'm happy to provide my perspective on it, but you sat a little bit closer with the data. Okay, she's dialing back in. In the meantime.
Okay, so in the meantime, so actually I think this is a great question that Brian has posed, and I think that what this basically means, what we've learned from the survey, is that it's just really about the language that we're using. So what we've seen is that, and this connects to the previous question as well by Paulina, is that using the word well-being can lead to people having different ideas about what that means for them in their workplace. For some people, that could be more of an emotional thing, more of a mental thing, more of a spiritual thing, more of a physical thing, combination of all of those, or even something else. But using the word stress and the language that we use to communicate is really effective. It's one of those words that actually provokes people to understand and to be able to relate to on a personal level. So I think all that we're saying through the survey that we've learned is that the word stress resonates with people more easily. They understand what it means and it's tangible for them.
Yeah, thanks, Andre, for that. And we actually had a question comment earlier in the presentation around this issue of we need to be careful that we acknowledge the issue as being important to increase the well-being of educators as an end in itself, and not simply a means to improve the well-being and success of students. And that's a really important implication as we think about bringing these messages to educators. This is an interesting one where, this whole science of strategic framing gives us guidance on how to message to get more traction. So there's a bit of a strategic choice there sometimes where our data is pointing us with this one around stress framings versus well-being, around making sure that we acknowledge that this is going to improve the quality of education and make things better for students. That's a strategic choice that we think we can move this issue ahead. And I mean, I just think that it's a really important that we be involved in having the evidence influences us in that way, and it doesn't mean that we don't care about those issues. We can have those conversations in a different way, but our high-level messaging, I think, is going to be more effective if it's informed by the research.
Hi, it's Bonnie from the McConnell Foundation. I think, Charlie, you made this point, and it made me think about one of the examples that we had on framing was around people's perceptions on gay marriage in the U.S. And what they found was that when gay rights activists were framing it as a rights issue, as in, you know, people from the gay community should be allowed to marry because they should have the same rights as everyone else, they found that that actually was not gaining traction among lawmakers, and it wasn't actually influencing them in a positive direction. And so when they did some research on what was a better way of framing it, what they found is that when it's framed in terms of love, as in anyone who is in love should be allowed to get married, that actually had a greater impact on changing minds. And so it's a super interesting, I think, parallel that for them as well, it must have been a real shift because the principle of rights is so powerful. And I don't think, you know, I would imagine that many of them face this dilemma of a departure from a rights framework because they felt like it was so important, and yet it wasn't the most effective. And so I think I see some parallels there with that question of, well, teacher well-being is important because teachers themselves are important, and it's a goal in its own right. And I think, you know, no one on this call disagrees with that, and I think it's a super important principle. And I think we have the tension of, but is it the most effective way of talking about it? That's not what the data is telling us. And I think any of you on the call are welcome to take these recommendations as you see fit. I think, you know, it's not the final say on anything, but just wanted to share that that parallel example just to give this a little bit more life.
Thanks, Bonnie. Any other questions that have come in, Andre?
Yes, we have a question from Carl Wheeler. To ensure that wellness programs are successful and highly utilized, are senior leaders seen to be the key to a program's success? Are they the only contributing factor to success? So it's the question about senior leaders, wellness programs, and if they are to be highly successful and utilized, are these senior leaders key to that program's success? And are they the only contributing factor?
Yeah, those are not questions that we specifically explored in this study. However, relating to other research that I've certainly seen, there is something that was done over at the University of Alberta around essential conditions for comprehensive school health. So what are the conditions that need to be in place for effective health programming to have impact? One of those conditions is senior leadership buy-in. So it's not the only condition that's important, but is one that is very, very important. Our work at WellAhead has tended to focus on building relationships with senior leadership because we see that it's really, really important. And the whole school community is also really important to engage in this. So when we're thinking about students, teachers, parents, all levels of those systems are important to move this issue ahead.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I just wanted to add on that point as well through some of the research that I've looked at as well. Senior leaders, so leaders in any types of organization, when it comes to workplace well-being, they're highly important in crafting a vision and key objectives in consultation with their staff for leading a whole workplace, whole school culture that supports the well-being of staff. But like I was saying at the beginning of this presentation as well, we also know that people on the ground, so how we speak and how we talk, we all contribute to a culture. So I think, you know, a leader can set a vision and a culture and get people around that vision. And at the end of the day, it really is up to everyone to buy into that culture and just, you know, really think about how they're speaking and talking.
Great, thanks, Andre. We're noticing another question from Charlie here. So some of our approaches are stressing that addressing all staff, so not just teachers' needs at the same time, is important. Does this conflict with the start with teachers concept? Tova, are you back on the line and able to respond to this one in particular? Okay, I think she's having some technical difficulties with getting back onto the line. With this one, we actually did focus the survey specifically on responding to questions about teachers versus responding to questions about principals. So our data actually doesn't really speak to the broader school staff. This has been an important part of framing our work to date, is that we do talk about teachers, staff, and leader well-being, but we actually don't have data to form any conclusions on that particular one. Vani's going to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I think in this question, maybe what we're seeing is the difference between communicating about the issue and developing strategies on the issue. So I think, you know, what we can maybe take from these findings is that when you're trying to communicate the importance of this, like if you're trying to convince someone, whether it's, you know, a sort of leader in your workplace, or whether you're trying to convince, you know, politicians or others, if you're in a place of having to convince, then probably leading with teachers as being the kind of closest to the ground is likely to be the most effective. When you're actually in the place of developing strategies, then I think it's, you know, it is really important to take into account all of the adults in the building, you know, teachers, support staff, educational assistants, principals, all of those. I think what we know is that taking a really comprehensive approach when you're implementing workplace well-being efforts is important, but doesn't necessarily, you know, need to be sort of the first or second thing that you say when you're trying to communicate about this, when you're trying to convince people. So it might overcomplicate the message by making it about all of those different stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Vani. Any final questions that are coming through the chat, Andre?
Yes, we have a question that was posed by Carrie Christie. Was there any research around which stakeholder group would help affect the most change?
Yeah, again, I think this is similar to the question around our senior leaders, the most important stakeholder. This particular piece of research was not solving for that question. So, however, I would just refer back to sort of our response to the last one, in that senior leadership is really and kind of a necessary part of that picture, as well as developing strategies to engage that broader school community.
Okay, and we have 4 minutes left on the clock. We have not a question, but more of an idea or statement from Charlie. He says that there is also some resistance to linking staff well-being to students, the need to see it as an issue in its own right. And so he says that, so it's a delicate balance in terms of addressing it, but also in communication. So the need to see staff well-being as important to invest in its own right, and not just linking it to the impact that it would have in terms of students.
Yeah, I think this is one that thematically we've already addressed, and thinking about there's a difference between, again, like how do we message to get traction on this and what the strategy should actually look like, right? So we know teachers are really important, and we know that their well-being is important in its own right. And what this study is telling us is that to strategically frame the issue to move it ahead, we need to link that to how this is serving student success and well-being as well.
I think what Charlie said later on is that unions and associations might be a slightly different audience in terms of you know, how to apply these findings, and I think that's a really interesting point to keep in mind. I don't know that everything that's being said is applied equally to every single stakeholder group, so we would encourage you to keep in mind, you know, who is your audience and what matters to them, and tailor your messaging accordingly.
Amazing.
Great, Andre, we're just noticing another one here that's of interest. So from Stuart Miller, not sure this is a question, more of a statement, but possibly an exploration of strategy. So the research is clear, but one of the challenges is how do we position staff wellness in the public domain? Being a public institution, we're frequently criticized for money not spent in the classroom, and for some, it's a big red flag. Consequently, do we default to not spending as much as we like on wellness?
So just a reminder here, just in case Stuart joined a little bit later, is that actually the majority of our sample came from the public. So what all of the recommendations that have come out of the survey are based on public opinion, and I think, you know, the key learnings that apply to this question are link it to priority issues in education. So rather than framing staff well-being as a separate priority issue, making it really about how to achieve the greatest possible quality of education, the greatest possible student outcomes. So it's not seen as being in competition with, you know, either you're going to spend money on teacher well-being or you're going to spend money on the classroom, but rather making that really strong link between, if you care about what's happening in the classroom, this is what's going to help us get there.
All right, so we are just about at our end of our webinar. We do see some more comments and questions. Thank you so much for that. There is a comment from Cindy Andrew about working on tools and common messaging. I would just encourage you to either contact us or just check out our website, Well at Work, edcan.ca/wellatwork, or the WellAhead.ca website for more information and resources. We are constantly coming out with new content. And we just encourage everyone to reach out to us with any questions or any ideas or suggestions on how we could work together and collaborate.
Great, and there might have been some questions or comments in the chat box that were specifically directed at McConnell, WellAhead, or at EdCan. And so if you have a request or a question directly to us, we encourage you to just send it by email, and we're happy to follow up.
Absolutely, and I'd just like to send a big thank you. Tova had a few technical difficulties joining back on for the question period here, but I just want to thank her and her team for all their amazing work that they've done on this study and working really closely with us on it. And also thank you to EdCan and specifically to Andre for your work on the presentation today and all the great work you guys have been doing on Well at Work.